Some people spend their whole lives searching for the one person who makes them feel complete. For 58-year-old cowboy Clayton Jessup, that person was always Millie Ray, even when life pulled them apart. Now, after years of building his fortune, he's come back to the dusty town of Willow Creek. Millie is a widow now, the daughter of a poor blacksmith, raising her grandson alone. Clayton rides 500 miles with a single wildflower in his hand to ask her to marry him. Her answer shocks everyone. "Yes, Clayton, but only if we marry today." She won't gamble with time anymore, not after losing so much already. But what secret from their past made Millie so desperate to marry immediately? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek as Clayton Jessup guided his weathered horse through the town that had haunted his dreams for 3 decades. The leather reins felt familiar in his calloused hands, but everything else had changed. Where Murphy's General Store once stood with its bright red paint and welcoming porch, now sat a faded building with broken shutters and a for sale sign that looked as weathered as Clayton felt. He pulled his broad-brimmed hat lower against the sun's glare, his silver-streaked hair catching the light. The town had aged harder than he had. Storefronts that once bustled with activity now stood empty, their windows clouded with dust and neglect. The railroad had passed Willow Creek by 5 years ago, taking with it the lifeblood that had kept this community thriving. Now it was a place where dreams came to die, where young folks left as soon as they could manage it, leaving behind only the stubborn and the stuck. But Clayton hadn't come back for the town. He'd come back for her. 3 miles away, in a small cabin that sat like a humble prayer at the edge of what used to be the blacksmith's property, Millie Ray Henderson wiped the morning dew from her tomato plants with the same gentle care she'd shown everything precious in her life. Her hands, though lined with years of honest work, moved with the grace of someone who understood that tender things required tender treatment. At 49, Millie had learned to find peace in small things. The way morning light filtered through her kitchen window, the sound of her 12-year-old grandson Tommy's laughter echoing from the barn where he fed their 2 chickens, the simple satisfaction of coaxing life from the hard-packed earth that surrounded their modest home. She paused in her gardening, straightening slowly to ease the persistent ache in her lower back. The cabin behind her told the story of a life lived with dignity despite hardship. Every board had been carefully maintained, every window cleaned until it sparkled, every surface scrubbed until it gleamed. Poverty had never been an excuse for slovenliness in Millie's world, a lesson her dear departed mother had taught her with firm but loving hands. "Grandma Millie." Tommy's voice carried across the yard, bright with the kind of enthusiasm that only 12-year-old boys could muster for the most ordinary things. "Henrietta laid 2 eggs this morning, 2. Millie smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something beautiful. "Well, I reckon that calls for a celebration breakfast," she called back. "Go wash up and I'll get the skillet hot." Inside the cabin, she moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. The kitchen was small but perfectly organized, every pot and pan in its place, every surface clean enough to eat from. On the windowsill above the sink sat a collection of mason jars filled with wildflowers that Tommy brought her each week, simple bouquets that cost nothing but brought her more joy than all the store-bought flowers in the world. As she reached for her well-worn Bible to read while breakfast cooked, a photograph slipped from between the pages of Psalms and fluttered to the floor. Millie's breath caught in her throat as she bent to retrieve it, her fingers trembling slightly as they touched the faded edges. The photograph was 20 years old, taken at the county fair by a traveling photographer who'd charged them 50 cents they could barely afford. But Clayton had insisted, saying a man needed proof of the most beautiful day of his life. In the sepia-toned image, a young Clayton Jessup stood with his arm around an even younger Millie Ray, both of them grinning with the kind of happiness that comes from believing the whole world stretches out before you like an endless summer day. She'd hidden this photograph in her Bible 8 years ago, the day she'd married Harold Henderson, a good man who'd deserved a wife whose heart wasn't partially buried in the past. Harold had been patient and kind, never asking about the sadness that sometimes clouded her eyes on quiet evenings. He'd given her stability and respectability, and she'd given him loyalty and companionship. It hadn't been the grand passion of storybooks, but it had been enough. Now Harold was 3 years buried, taken by a fever that had swept through the county like a cruel wind, and Millie found herself alone again except for Tommy, Harold's grandson, who'd come to live with them when his own parents died in a wagon accident. She studied the photograph, tracing Clayton's young face with one finger. He'd been 28 then, all lean muscle and easy grins, with eyes the color of summer sky and hands that could gentle the wildest horse or hold her with infinite tenderness. Those hands had written her letters that made her heart sing, had built her a small wooden jewelry box that she treasured more than diamonds, had touched her face with such reverence that she'd felt beautiful despite her simple calico dresses and work-worn shoes. And then he'd left. The memory still carried the power to stop her breath. One day he'd been there, planning their future with the earnest intensity that made her love him even more. And the next day he was gone. No explanation, no goodbye, just an empty space where her heart used to be, and townspeople whispering about some trouble involving cattle and accusations she'd never fully understood. She'd waited. Lord help her, she'd waited 3 years for him to come back, to explain, to make sense of the senseless. She'd written him letters she never sent, had scanned every crowd for his familiar silhouette, had dreamed of him so often that waking up became a daily heartbreak. Tommy's footsteps on the porch pulled her back to the present. She quickly tucked the photograph back into her Bible, smoothing her apron and composing her face into the serene expression that had become her shield against the world's curiosities. "Smells good in here," Tommy said, sliding into his chair at the small kitchen table. At 12, he was all elbows and knees, growing so fast that she could barely keep him in clothes that fit. But his eyes held an old soul's wisdom, probably from losing his parents so young. He was a good boy, gentle and thoughtful, with Harold's steady nature and his late mother's quick smile. "Henrietta's eggs deserve our best effort," Millie said, sliding a plate of eggs, bacon and biscuits in front of him. "Eat up, you've got chores before school." As Tommy ate with the focused dedication of a growing boy, Millie found her gaze drifting to the window that faced the road. It was a habit she'd developed over the years, watching the road, though she'd stopped admitting to herself what she was watching for. Across town, Clayton had finally worked up the courage to dismount in front of what used to be the Silver Dollar Saloon. The building now housed Doc Henderson's medical practice, the swinging doors replaced with a proper wooden door painted a respectable green. He tied his horse to the hitching post and stood for a moment, gathering his nerve. 30 years was a long time to carry the weight of regret. 30 years was long enough to build a fortune from nothing, to earn respect from hard men in harder country, to prove to himself that he was more than the frightened young man who'd fled this town under cover of darkness. But 30 years wasn't long enough to forget the way Millie's laugh sounded like music, or the way she'd looked at him like he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered. He'd tried to forget her. God knows he'd tried. There had been other women in other towns, good women who would have made fine wives. But none of them had been Millie Ray, and in the end, that had made all the difference. The door to Doc Henderson's office opened, and a familiar figure emerged. Clayton's hand moved instinctively to his hat brim, in greeting as Doc Henderson, older now, his hair white, where it had once been brown, but still carrying himself with the dignity that had made him the most respected man in town, looked up and froze. "Well, I'll be damned," Doc said softly, his voice carrying wonder and caution in equal measure. "Clayton Jessup, heard you were dead." "Not quite," Clayton replied, managing a slight smile, "though I can understand why folks might think so." Doc stepped closer, studying Clayton with the same careful attention he'd once used to examine patients. "You look good, son. Prosperous. Life's been kind to you." "Kind enough," Clayton said. "Doc, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me straight. Is Shy's Millie?" "She's well," Doc said gently. "Widowed 3 years now. Lives out at the old Henderson place with her boy Harold's grandson. Really, but she's raised him as her own. Good woman, Clayton. Deserves happiness." Clayton nodded, relief and nervousness warring in his chest. "I aim to see she gets it." Doc's eyebrows rose. "That's so. And what makes you think you're the man to provide it?" It was a fair question, and Clayton respected the older man enough to give it the consideration it deserved. "Because I never stopped loving her," he said simply. "Because I've spent 30 years learning how to be the man she deserved, and I'm hoping it's not too late to prove it." Doc studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "She lives about 3 miles out, past the old mill, but Clayton, tread careful. She's not the girl you left behind. Life has a way of changing us all." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the dusty streets with golden light, Clayton remounted his horse and turned toward the road that would take him to Millie. In his saddlebag, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, lay a single wildflower he'd picked that mornina purple prairie aster, the same kind he'd given her on their first real date all those years ago. Some might call it foolish, a man of 58 riding across the country with nothing but hope and a flower to offer the woman who'd owned his heart since he was young enough to believe in forever. But Clayton had learned that the truly important things in life were often the simplest: love freely given, truth honestly spoken, and the courage to reach for happiness, even when the reaching might break your heart all over again. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road made Millie look up from her afternoon mending. Tommy was at school, and she rarely had visitor, certainly none who announced themselves with the steady rhythm of a horse ridden by someone who knew how to handle the animal with confidence and care. She set down the small shirt she'd been patching and moved to the window, her heart doing something strange in her chest as she recognized the silhouette approaching her gate. 30 years might have passed, but some things become so deeply etched in memory that time cannot blur their edges. The way he sat his horse, the angle of his shoulders, the careful way he moved, as if he understood that every action carried weight and consequence. Clayton Jessup was riding up her path like something out of a dream she'd trained herself to stop having. Millie's hand flew to her hair, smoothing strands that had escaped her simple bun, then to her apron, brushing away imaginary dust. She forced herself to stop, to breathe, to remember that she was a grown woman who had lived through love and loss and everything in between. Whatever Clayton Jessup wanted, she could handle it with the dignity she'd cultivated like a garden over these long years. But when she opened the door and saw him dismounting at her gate, when she looked into those blue eyes that had haunted her dreams and nightmares in equal measure, all her carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble like dry leaves. He was older, of course. The lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, and his dark hair had gone silver at the temples. But he was still tall and lean, still moved with that careful grace that had always made her pulse quicken. And when he looked at her, really looked at her, as if she were the only thing in the world worth seeing, she was 21 again and foolishly, desperately in love. "Hello, Millie," he said softly, his voice carrying the same warm rumble that had whispered her name in 1,000 memories. "Clayton." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, though her heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it across the yard. "It's been a long time." "Too long," he said, and there was such regret in those 2 words that she felt her carefully maintained walls begin to crack. He approached, slowly, respectfully, stopping a proper distance away. In his hand, she noticed, he held something small, a flash of purple against his weathered palm. "May I come closer?" he asked, and the courtesy of it, the way he asked permission, instead of assuming welcome, touched something deep in her chest. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched as he opened her gate and walked up the path she swept every morning. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps, looking up at her with an expression so tender and hopeful that it took her breath away. "I know I have no right to be here," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "I know I forfeited any claim to your time or attention the day I left without explanation. But Millie, I need you to know not a day has passed in 30 years that I haven't thought of you. Not a sunset I've watched that I haven't wished you were there to see it with me." Millie gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. "Clayton, you can't just—" "I know," he said quickly. "I know I can't waltz back into your life and expect anything. I know you've built a good life here, and I respect that. But I had to come. I had to try to explain, to apologize, to tell you that leaving you was the biggest mistake I ever made." The late afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair, and for a moment she could see both the young man she'd loved and the older man he'd become, superimposed like double-exposed photographs. The effect was dizzying. "Why now?" she asked, and she hated how her voice broke slightly on the words. "Why, after all this time?" Clayton's jaw worked for a moment, as if he was struggling with how much truth to reveal. "Because I finally have something worth offering," he said. "Because I spent 30 years learning how to be the man you deserved, and I'm hoping, praying that it's not too late." He held up the purple flower, and she saw his hand was trembling slightly. "Prairie aster," he said. "Same as the first flower I ever gave you. I picked it this morning, hoping I'd have the courage to give it to you again." The memory hit her like a physical blow, their first real date, a church picnic by the creek, where he'd shyly presented her with a bouquet of wildflowers. He'd picked himself because he couldn't afford store-bought roses. She'd treasured those flowers until they crumbled to dust, pressing the petals between the pages of her Bible, where they remained to this day. "Clayton," she whispered, and the name felt foreign and familiar on her tongue. "I know you were married," he said, taking one careful step closer. "Doc told me about Harold, and I'm sorry for your loss. He was a good man, and I'm glad he was here when I couldn't be. But Millie, if there's any part of you that remembers what we had, any part that might be willing to try again." And then he did something that stopped her heart completely. Clayton Jessup, who had become wealthy and successful, and probably had his pick of younger, prettier women, got down on one knee on her humble porch step and held up that simple wildflower like it was made of diamonds. "Millie Ray Henderson," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The world seemed to stop spinning, the birds stopped singing, even the wind held its breath. Millie stared down at this man who had broken her heart so thoroughly that she'd thought it would never heal properly, who had disappeared from her life like smoke, who was now kneeling before her with tears in his eyes and a flower in his hand. And without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences or what people would say, or whether it made any sense at all, she heard herself say, "Yes." Clayton's face transformed, relief and joy, chasing away the anxiety that had lined his features. He started to stand, started to smile, but she held up her hand. "But only if we marry today." The words surprised her as much as they obviously surprised him. He froze, half risen, staring at her with confusion and hope warring on his face. "Today," he repeated. Millie reached behind her neck with shaking fingers and unclasped the thin gold chain that held her wedding ring, Harold's ring, which she'd worn on a necklace since his death because it felt wrong to abandon it entirely, but equally wrong to wear it on her finger when her heart had never fully belonged to him. She held the ring up, studying it in the fading light. It was a simple gold band, worn thin in places, bought with money Harold had saved for months. It represented 8 years of companionship, respect, and gentle affection. It represented security and stability and all the practical reasons people married when passion had been buried in the past. "I learned something when Harold died," she said quietly, still looking at the ring. "I learned that tomorrow isn't promised to anyone. I wasted 3 years waiting for you to come back, then 8 years married to a good man. I couldn't love the way he deserved because my heart was still tied to a ghost. I won't waste any more time, Clayton. If you want to marry me, if you mean what you're saying, then we do it today. before either of us can change our minds or let fear talk us out of it, or find 100 reasons why it won't work. She looked down at him, still kneeling on her step, and saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "I'm 49 years old," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've buried a husband and raised a boy, and learned to make do with less than I wanted, and be grateful for what I had. I'm not the girl you left behind, Clayton. I'm not going to wait around while you decide if you really want this, or if I'm just some romantic notion you've been carrying around. If you want me, you take me as I am today, or you ride on out of here and let me get back to my life." Clayton rose slowly to his feet, his eyes never leaving her face. The wildflower trembled in his hand. "Today," he said, and his voice was full of wonder and determination. "Yes, Millie, today." News traveled fast in a town the size of Willow Creek, especially news as shocking as Clayton Jessup's return and his immediate engagement to the widow Henderson. By the time Tommy walked home from school, kicking stones and whistling a tune he'd learned from the older boys, half the town was buzzing with speculation, and the other half was shaking their heads in disapproval. Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the unofficial keeper of community morals, had already declared it unseemly for a woman to accept a proposal from a man who'd abandoned her decades ago. "Mark my words," she told anyone who would listen while she hung laundry behind her establishment, "no good will come of such hastiness. Decent people don't marry on a whim." But Doc Henderson, making his afternoon rounds, found himself smiling as he recalled the look in Clayton's eyes, the same desperate hope he'd seen in dying men who'd suddenly found a reason to fight for another day. And Sheriff Blake, a man who'd learned to judge character through 30 years of dealing with the best and worst of humanity, remembered the young Clayton as honest and hard-working, the kind of man who'd step between a bully and his victim without counting the cost. "Always thought there was more to that story," Blake murmured to his deputy as they watched Clayton ride toward the parsonage. "Man doesn't run unless he's got a damn good reason." At the Henderson cabin, Millie moved through her familiar evening routine with hands that shook only slightly. She'd sent Clayton to speak with Reverend Matthews about performing the ceremony at dawn, and now she was left alone with the magnitude of what she'd committed to doing. Tommy burst through the door with his usual energy, then stopped short when he saw her face. At 12, he'd developed the kind of intuition that comes from loss and ability to read the emotional currents in a room and know when something significant had shifted. "Grandma Millie," he said cautiously, "you look different." She turned from the stove where she'd been stirring a pot of stew with unnecessary vigor. "Sit down, sweetheart. We need to talk." Tommy slid into his usual chair, his schoolbooks forgotten on the floor. His young face was serious, already bracing for news that might change everything. He'd learned early that life had a way of pulling the ground out from under you when you least expected it. "Do you remember the stories I used to tell you about when I was young?" Millie asked, settling across from him. "About the cowboy who used to court me before I married your grandfather, Harold?" Tommy nodded. Those stories had been his favorite tales of a handsome young man who could gentle wild horses and make Grandma Millie laugh until she cried. He'd always wondered why the stories stopped so abruptly, why the cowboy had simply vanished from the tales like smoke. "Well," Millie said, reaching across to take his hands, "that cowboy came back today. His name is Clayton Jessup, and he's asked me to marry him." Tommy's eyes widened. "The cowboy from the stories, he's real?" "Very real," Millie confirmed. And I said yes. But Tommy struggled to process this information. "When? I mean, when would you—" "Tomorrow morning," Millie said gently. "At sunrise." The silence that followed was profound. Tommy stared at her as if she'd suddenly announced she could fly. "Tomorrow, but that's really soon." "It is," she agreed. "Tommy, I know this is sudden and probably frightening. Your whole life is going to change, and I should have given you more time to prepare. But sometimes—" She paused, searching for words that a 12-year-old could understand. "Sometimes when life offers you a second chance at happiness, you have to be brave enough to take it, even when it scares you." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his young mind working through the implications. "Will he be nice to me?" he finally asked, and the vulnerability in the question broke Millie's heart. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, coming around the table to pull him into her arms. "He's a good man. I wouldn't marry someone who wasn't kind to you. You're the most important thing in my world, and that will never change. But what if he doesn't like me? What if he doesn't want me around?" Millie held him tighter, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair that still smelled like childhood despite his growing independence. "Then he wouldn't be worthy of either of us," she said firmly, "but I hope you'll like each other very much." Meanwhile, across town, Clayton was having his own difficult conversation. Reverend Matthews, a thin man with kind eyes and hands that had blessed more unions than he could count, listened without interruption as Clayton explained his unusual request. "Dawn tomorrow," the Reverend repeated when Clayton finished. "That's quite soon, son." "I know how it looks," Clayton said, turning his hat in his hands. "But Reverend, I've loved this woman for 30 years. I've spent 3 decades regretting the day I left her, and I won't risk losing her again." "And what about the boy, Harold's grandson?" Clayton's expression grew thoughtful. "I met Harold a few times back in the day. He was a good man, steady and honest. If he raised that boy, even for a few years, then I expect I'll be proud to call him family." Reverend Matthews studied Clayton carefully. The man before him bore little resemblance to the wild young cowboy who disappeared in the night all those years ago. This Clayton carried himself with quiet confidence, spoke with measured consideration, and looked the Reverend directly in the eye when he talked about his intentions. "There'll be talk," the Reverend warned. "People will say it's too fast, too sudden. They'll question your motives and her judgment." "Let them talk," Clayton said simply. "Millie and I have wasted enough years caring what other people think." As the sun set over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Clayton made his way back toward Millie's cabin. In his saddlebags, wrapped carefully in oiled leather, were documents that would surprise everyone who thought they knew him, deeds to property worth more than most men in this county would see in 10 lifetimes, bank drafts that could transform this struggling town, and a will that left everything to the woman who'd owned his heart since he was young enough to believe love could conquer anything. He'd spent 30 years building his fortune with one goal in mind: to become worthy of Millie Ray. Cattle drives in Texas, land speculation in Colorado, mining investments in California, every risk he'd taken, every dollar he'd earned, had been motivated by the hope that someday he might have enough to offer her the life she deserved. Now, as his horse picked its way carefully along the familiar road, Clayton allowed himself to imagine a different kind of future. Tomorrow morning, if all went well, he would wake up as Millie's husband. He would have a family again, a home that meant more than just a place to rest between journeys. He would have the chance to be the man he'd always hoped to become, not just successful, but genuinely happy. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and steady as a promise. Clayton touched the brim of his hat in a small salute to whatever forces had brought him back, to this moment, this chance, this woman who still made his heart race like a young man's. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The pre-dawn hours brought a stillness to Willow Creek that felt almost sacred, as if the world itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Millie had barely slept, and what little rest she'd managed had been filled with dreams that tangled memory and hope into something too fragile to examine closely. She stood before her small mirror, adjusting the collar of her best dresser deep blue cotton that she'd sewn herself 2 years ago for church occasions. It wasn't a wedding dress in any traditional sense, but it was clean and modest and made her feel like herself, which seemed more important than any amount of silk or lace. On her dresser lay her mother's cameo brooch, a delicate piece carved from ivory that had belonged to 3 generations of women in her family. She'd worn it the day she married Harold, and before that, her mother had worn it when she married Millie's father. It wasn't valuable in any monetary sense. The ivory was slightly yellowed, and the gold setting had lost some of its luster, but it carried the weight of love passed down through generations. Millie picked up the brooch with trembling fingers. Her mother had been gone 15 years now, but she could still hear her gentle voice offering advice about love and marriage and the importance of following your heart, even when your head counseled caution. "What would you think of this, Mama?" she whispered to the empty room. "Would you say I'm being foolish or brave?" In the kitchen, Tommy sat at the table picking at a piece of toast, his young face serious with the weight of thoughts too heavy for a 12-year-old to carry alone. He'd dressed carefully in his church clothes, the brown wool pants that were getting too short, and the white shirt that Millie had pressed until it was crisp as fresh snow. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," Millie said gently, fastening the cameo at her throat. "I know this is all very strange and sudden." Tommy looked up at her, and she was struck by how much he'd grown in just the past year. Soon he'd be a young man, with decisions of his own to make, and a life to build beyond the safe confines of their small cabin. "I want to come," he said firmly. "If you're getting married, then I should be there. That's what family does." The simple statement brought tears to Millie's eyes. This boy, who had already lost so much, was choosing to trust her judgment and support her happiness. It was a gift of such generosity that it took her breath away. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "That means everything to me." As the eastern sky began to lighten from black to deep purple, they made their way along the path that led to the small chapel behind the main church building. The chapel was used for smaller ceremonies and prayer meetings, a humble stone structure that had witnessed more than 50 years of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. Clayton was already waiting, standing beside Reverend Matthews in the soft light of dawn. He dressed in his finest clothes, a black suit that had clearly been made by skilled hands, a white shirt that gleamed in the morning light, and boots polished to a mirror shine. But it was his face that caught Millie's attention, the way his expression transformed when he saw her walking toward him. Wonder, that was the only word for it. He looked at her as if she was something miraculous, something he'd stopped believing he deserved. The intensity of his gaze made her feel beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth or fashion, and everything to do with being truly seen by someone who valued what he was looking at. Also present were the few people who'd chosen to support this unconventional union. Doc Henderson, his medical bag set carefully on a nearby pew as if he'd come prepared for any emergency. Sheriff Blake, still wearing his badge, but with his hat respectfully removed, and two neighbor women, Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Patterson, who had decided that love should be celebrated regardless of its timing. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, his voice carrying easily in the small space. "We are gathered here, in the sight of God, to witness the union of Clayton Jessup and Millie Ray Henderson in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Millie like a benediction. She'd heard them before, 8 years ago, when she'd married Harold in this same chapel, with half the town in attendance. But this felt entirely different, more intimate, more intentional, more like a choice made from the heart rather than from practical necessity. When the Reverend asked for the vows, Clayton turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his weathered ones. The words he spoke were simple but weighted with years of longing. "Millie, I promise to love you with everything I have for whatever time we're given. I promise to be worthy of the gift of your heart and to spend every day trying to make up for the years we lost. I promise to be a good husband to you and a good father to Tommy, if he'll have me." Millie's own vows came from a place deeper than thought. "Clayton, I promise to trust in this love we've found again, to be brave enough to choose happiness even when it frightens me. I promise to be your wife and your partner, to share in your joys and sorrows, and to never again let fear keep us apart." The exchange of rings was simple. Clayton had purchased 2 plain gold bands from the jeweler the evening before, nothing fancy but solid and true. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Millie felt the weight of it like a promise made real. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Matthews said with a gentle smile. Clayton's kiss was tender and reverent, a man touching something precious he'd thought lost forever. When they broke apart, Millie saw tears in his eyes that matched her own. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Reverend announced to their small gathering, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Clayton Jessup." The modest applause that followed felt like thunder in the quiet morning air. Mrs. Carter dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and even Sheriff Blake looked suspiciously misty. But it was Tommy's reaction that mattered most to Millie Boy. Stepped forward, and after a moment's hesitation, extended his hand to Clayton. "Welcome to the family," Tommy said solemnly, as if he were the adult offering benediction to this new arrangement. Clayton shook the offered hand with the gravity it deserved, then surprised everyone by getting down on one knee to meet Tommy at eye level. "Thank you," he said simply. "I hope I can earn that welcome." As the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the small wedding party emerged from the chapel into a world that felt somehow different than it had an hour before. Millie walked beside her new husband, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, and for the first time in 30 years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The first morning of their marriage dawned with the kind of golden light that made even the humblest surroundings look touched by grace. Millie woke in her own bed, in her own small cabin, but everything felt different, charged with possibility, and weighted with the reality of the choice she'd made. Clayton had spent the night in the barn, a gesture of respect that had surprised no one more than Millie herself. "We may be married in the eyes of God and the law," he'd said quietly after their wedding breakfast, "but I won't presume anything. You need time to get used to the idea of me being here, and I need to prove I'm worth the trust you've placed in me." Now, as she prepared breakfast for 3 instead of 2, Millie found herself listening for the sound of Clayton's movements in the yard. Through the kitchen window, she could see him helping Tommy with the morning chores, their heads bent together over some task that had them both laughing. The sight stirred something deep in her chest, a longing she'd buried so thoroughly she'd almost forgotten it existed. The longing for partnership, for shared burdens and double joys, for someone who saw her not just as a caretaker but as a woman worthy of consideration and respect. "Morning, Mrs. Jessup," Clayton said as he and Tommy came through the door, both of them carrying buckets of fresh milk and water. The name sounded strange on his lips, strange to her ears, but not unpleasant. "Morning," she replied, proud that her voice came out steady. "Breakfast is almost ready." As they sat around the small table, sharing eggs and biscuits, and the easy conversation of people learning to be a family, Clayton reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "There's something I need to discuss with both of you," he said, his tone serious enough to make Tommy look up from his plate with concern. "About my circumstances." Millie set down her coffee cup, bracing herself for whatever revelation was coming. In the clear light of morning, the magnitude of what she'd done marrying a man she hadn't seen in 30 years was beginning to sink in. She realized she knew almost nothing about his life, his character, his means. "I want to be completely honest about what you've gotten yourselves into by taking me on," Clayton continued, unfolding the paper. "This is a bank draft made out in my name. It represents a portion of my holdings, not all, but enough to ensure that neither of you will ever want for anything material again." He placed the document on the table where they could both see it. Millie glanced at the amount written in careful script and felt the blood drain from her face. The sum was larger than anything she'd ever imagined, more money than most people in Willow Creek would see in 10 lifetimes. "Clayton," she whispered, how did you?" "Honestly," he said firmly, "every penny earned through legitimate business. Cattle drives in Texas, land speculation in Colorado, mining investments in California. I've been blessed with good instincts and better luck, and I've lived simply while I built something substantial." Tommy stared at the bank draft with the wide eyes of a boy trying to comprehend numbers that had no real meaning in his experience. "Are we rich?" he asked, with the directness that only children could manage. "We're comfortable," Clayton corrected gently. "More than comfortable. But money is just a tool, Tommy. What matters is what we do with it." Millie pushed back from the table, suddenly feeling overwhelmed. "This is too much," she said, pacing to the window. "Clayton, I didn't marry you for your money. I didn't even know you had money. People are going to think—" "Let them think what they want," Clayton said, rising to follow her. "Millie, I didn't tell you about this to impress you or to make you feel obligated. I told you because we're married now, and married people shouldn't have secrets from each other. This money, it's yours now too, yours and Tommy's." She turned to face him, confusion and fear warring in her expression. "But what are people going to say? They already think this marriage is too sudden, too strange, when they find out about your wealth. They'll say I'm a gold digger." Clayton finished with a slight smile. "A man who came back to prey on a poor widow's loneliness. Let them say it, Millie. We know the truth." Before she could respond, the sound of voices outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a small group of townspeople approaching Mrs. Abernathy leading the charge, with several other women trailing behind her like soldiers following a general into battle. "Oh no," Millie breathed, recognizing the determined set of Mrs. Abernathy's shoulders. "They're coming to give me a piece of their minds about yesterday." Clayton's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Then we'll face them together." The knock on the door came sharp and insistent. Millie smoothed her apron and opened it to find Mrs. Abernathy flanked by 4 other women, all wearing expressions of barely contained disapproval. "Mrs. Henderson," Mrs. Abernathy began, then caught herself. "I mean, Mrs. Jessup, we've come to discuss this unusual situation." "Please come in," Millie said, though every instinct told her to close the door and lock it. "Would you like some coffee?" "This isn't a social call," Mrs. Abernathy replied curtly, but she stepped inside, her followers crowding behind her. Her eyes immediately found Clayton, who had positioned himself protectively near Millie's shoulder. "Mr. Jessup, we weren't properly introduced yesterday." "Ma'am," Clayton said with a polite nod that somehow managed to convey both respect and a complete lack of intimidation. "We're concerned," Mrs. Patterson said, wringing her hands nervously, "about the haste of this union. It's got the whole town talking." "And what exactly are they saying?" Millie asked, though she dreaded the answer. Mrs. Abernathy's lips pursed, as if she'd tasted something sour. "That you've been taken advantage of by a smooth, talking stranger. That no decent woman marries a man the same day he proposes unless she's got reasons to be in a hurry." The implication hung in the air like smoke, ugly and choking. Tommy, who had been quietly listening from his seat at the table, stood up with the righteous indignation that only children could summon. "That's not true," he said hotly. "Grandma Millie isn't like that. She's good and honest, and if you can't see that, then you're the ones with the problem." "Tommy," Millie said gently, but Clayton placed a restraining hand on her arm. "The boy's right," Clayton said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that filled the small room. "My wife is the finest woman I've ever known, and anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to discuss the matter with me privately." The subtle threat in his tone wasn't lost on anyone present. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes narrowed, but she had enough sense to recognize when she was outmatched. "We're simply concerned for Millie's reputation," she said stiffly, "and for the boy's welfare." "Then you can rest easy," Clayton replied. "Both are in excellent hands." After the women left, their mission clearly unsuccessful, Millie sank into her chair with a shaky laugh. "Well," she said, "that went better than I expected." "Is it always going to be like this?" Tommy asked, still bristling with protective anger. "For a while," Clayton admitted. "But people will come around once they see that we're genuine. Small towns are suspicious of change, but they're also forgiving of happiness." He reached across the table and took Millie's hand, marveling at how right it felt to have that simple privilege again. "We'll face whatever comes together," he said, "all 3 of us." 3 days into their marriage, Tommy made a discovery that would change everything. He'd been exploring the small storage room above the Barner space Clayton had claimed for his belongings when his foot broke through a loose floorboard. Reaching down to investigate, his fingers closed around a leather bundle that had been hidden beneath the floor for who knew how long. The bundle contained letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon that had once been the exact color of Millie's favorite dress. Tommy recognized his grandmother's handwriting on the envelopes, though the ink had faded to brown with age. But it was the name written on each envelope that made his heart race: Clayton Jessup, care of the Cattleman's Hotel, Abilene, Texas. Letters that had never been sent. Tommy stared at the bundle in his hands, understanding instinctively that he was holding something precious and painful. These weren't just any letters, they were love letters, written by a young woman to a man who had disappeared from her life without explanation. He climbed down from the loft with careful steps, the letters clutched against his chest. In the cabin, he found Millie kneading bread dough with the focused intensity she brought to tasks when her mind was troubled. Clayton was in town, meeting with the banker about some business matter he'd been deliberately vague about. "Grandma Millie," Tommy said softly, setting the bundle on the kitchen table. Millie looked up from her dough, and when she saw what he was holding, her face went white. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and approached the table as if the letters might bite her. "Where did you find these?" she whispered. "In the loft above the barn. There was a loose board, and they were hidden underneath." Tommy's young face was serious with the weight of discovery. "They're addressed to Clayton, but they were never sent, were they?" Millie sank into her chair, her hands trembling as she reached for the topmost letter. She recognized her own young handwriting, the careful loops and flourishes she'd practiced until they were perfect. These letters represented months of heartbreak, of trying to reach across an impossible distance to a man who might as well have vanished from the earth. "No," she said quietly, "they were never sent." Tommy pulled up his chair closer to hers. "Will you read them to me? I think maybe they're important." Millie untied the ribbon with fingers that shook only slightly. The top letter was dated 3 months after Clayton's disappearance, written on a night when her loneliness had been so acute she could barely breathe. "My dearest Clayton," she read aloud, her voice soft with memory. "I don't know where you are, or if you'll ever read this, but I had to write it anyway. I had to tell someone how much I miss you, how empty everything feels without you here." The words transported her back to that terrible time, the endless days of waiting and wondering. The nights when she'd lain awake staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how someone could disappear so completely from her life. She'd written letter after letter, pouring her heart onto paper because she had nowhere else to put the love that was eating her alive. 3 months, and still no word from you," she continued reading. "People are starting to say terrible things, that you never really loved me, that you were just playing games with the blacksmith's daughter, but I know better. I felt how you looked at me, heard the truth in your voice when you told me you loved me. Something happened, something that made you leave, and I won't believe you abandoned me by choice until you tell me yourself." Tommy listened with the intense focus of someone trying to understand the adult world of love and loss. "Did you really believe that?" he asked. "That he didn't leave on purpose?" "I had to," Millie replied. "The alternative was too painful to bear." She opened another letter, this one dated 6 months later. Her handwriting was different, here more desperate, less controlled. "I'm going to stop waiting," she read. "Harold Henderson has asked me to marry him, and I think I'm going to say yes. He's a good man, steady and kind, and he doesn't look at me like I'm broken. I know I don't love him the way I loved you, but maybe that's better. Maybe loving someone so much that losing them destroys you isn't the blessing I thought it was." The pain in those words hit her like a physical blow, even 20 years later. She remembered writing that letter by candlelight, tears blurring her vision as she tried to convince herself that settling for companionship was better than holding on to hope for something that might never come. "But I need you to know," she continued, "that if you came back tomorrow, if you walked through that door and explained everything, I would leave with you without hesitation. I would choose you over security, over reputation, over everything else. Because some loves are worth any sacrifice, and what we had, what we still have, if I'm brave enough to admit itis that kind of love." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. Through the window, they could see Clayton riding up the path, his face thoughtful in the way that meant he'd been wrestling with something important. Tommy quickly gathered the letters back into their bundle. "Should we tell him about these?" Millie considered the question, then nodded slowly. "Yes, these letters were meant for him, even if they never reached him. He has a right to know what I was feeling, what I went through." When Clayton entered the cabin, he immediately sensed the changed atmosphere. Millie and Tommy were sitting close together at the table, both wearing expressions of someone who'd been sharing secrets. "What's wrong?" he asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Nothing's wrong," Millie said, standing to face him. "But Tommy found something today, something I think you need to see." She held out the bundle of letters, watching as recognition dawned in Clayton's eyes. He took them with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. "You wrote to me," he said wonderingly. "Every week for almost 2 years, Millie confirmed. "I never sent them because I didn't know where you were. I didn't even know if you were alive." Clayton sank into the remaining chair, the letters spread before him like pieces of a broken heart made visible. "Millie, if I had known if I had received even one of these—" "I know," she said softly. "That's why I want you to read them now, so you'll understand what those years were like for me. So you'll know that I never stopped loving you, even when I married Harold, even when I tried to convince myself that love like ours was just a young woman's foolishness." Clayton picked up the first letter with hands that trembled slightly. "Will you read them with me?" Tommy looked between the two adults, understanding that he was witnessing something profound and private. "Maybe I should." "Stay," Clayton said firmly. "You're part of this family now, and this is part of our story, all of our story." As the three of them sat together in the fading afternoon light, reading words of love and loss, written by a young woman to a vanished lover, the last walls between them began to crumble. These letters were more than just artifacts of the past. They were proof that some loves survive any separation, that hope can endure, even when it seems foolish, and that sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we have with people who aren't there to hear them. When they finished reading the last letter, Clayton carefully retied the blue ribbon around the bundle. "These are precious," he said quietly. "They're proof of something I always hoped, but never dared believe that our love meant as much to you as it did to me." He looked at both Millie and Tommy, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want to keep these forever," he said. "I want them to be part of our family's story, part of what we pass down to future generations, because they prove that love doesn't die just because circumstances force people apart. They prove that some promises are worth keeping, no matter how long it takes to fulfill them." Millie reached across the table and took his hand, marveling at how such a simple gesture could feel like coming home. "We're home now," she said softly. "All of us. Finally, we're home." It was Tommy who found the wanted poster, crumpled and yellowed with age, tucked between the pages of an old almanac Clayton had been using to plan his spring planting. The boy had been helping organize Clayton's books and papers when the folded document fell to the floor like a leaf shaken from a dying tree. The poster was crude, printed on cheap paper with ink that had faded to a rusty brown. But the words across the top were still legible enough to make Tommy's blood run cold. "Wanted for cattle rustling." And below that, in smaller print, Clayton Jessup, age 28, brown hair, blue eyes, approximately 6 feet tall, last seen in the vicinity of Willow Creek. Reward, 500 dead or alive. Tommy stared at the poster with the wide-eyed shock of a child whose world had just shifted on its axis. The man described on this paper was Clayton Clayton, the man who had married his grandmother and treated him with such gentle kindness. But the crimes described were serious, the kind that got men hanged in the public square while crowds cheered. "Grandma Millie," Tommy called, his voice high and tight with fear. "Grandma Millie, come quick." Millie appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw Tommy's pale face and the paper trembling in his hands, she knew immediately that something terrible had been discovered. "What is it, sweetheart?" Tommy held out the poster without a word. Millie took it, and as she read, the color drained from her face like water from a broken pitcher. Her legs suddenly felt unsteady, and she had to grip the doorframe to keep from swaying. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. "In Clayton's almanac. It just fell out when I opened it." Tommy's voice was small and scared. "Grandma Millie, this says he's a cattle rustler. This says there's a reward for capturing him dead or alive." Millie sank into the nearest chair, still staring at the poster. The man described could indeed be Clayton, though the physical description was vague enough to fit dozens of men. But the location, Willow Creek, and the timing made it impossible to dismiss as coincidence. "There has to be an explanation," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "This could be about someone else, someone who just happened to—" The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut her off. Through the window, they could see Clayton riding up the path, returning from his trip to the bank. His face was relaxed, almost cheerful, the expression of a man whose plans were falling into place exactly as he'd hoped. "What do we do?" Tommy asked urgently. "Do we confront him? Do we pretend we never saw it?" Millie folded the poster carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. "We ask him directly," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "If there's one thing I've learned in my life, it's that secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch. If Clayton has something to explain, then he needs to explain it." When Clayton entered the cabin, he immediately noticed the tension in the air. Millie and Tommy were both watching him with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for dangerous animals. "What's wrong?" he asked, removing his hat and hanging it on its peg. "You both look like you've seen a ghost." Millie reached into her apron and withdrew the folded poster. She held it out to him without a word, watching his face carefully for any flicker of recognition or guilt. Clayton took the poster and unfolded it slowly. When he saw what it was, his face went completely still. "Not guilty," Millie noted, but resigned, as if he'd been expecting this moment for 30 years. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "It fell out of your almanac," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Did you really?" "No," Clayton said firmly, looking directly at the boy. "I never stole a single head of cattle in my life, but I can understand why you'd be scared to see this." He moved to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, the poster spread before him like evidence in a trial. "I kept it," he said, "to remind myself what can happen when good men stay silent in the face of lies." Millie sat across from him, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Then tell us what really happened. Tell us why there's a wanted poster with your name on it." Clayton was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of the poster. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 30 years of buried truth. "There was a man named Jake Morrison," he began. "Still is, for all I know. He owned the largest ranch in the county, and he had his eye on your father's land, the blacksmith shop and the acreage that came with it. Problem was, your father wasn't interested in selling." Millie frowned. "I remember Jake Morrison. He was always very polite to Papa, always offering to help with repairs and such." "That was the public face," Clayton said grimly. "Privately, he was pressuring your father to sell, making threats about what might happen to a man who couldn't protect his property. When your father still refused, Morrison decided to try a different approach." Clayton stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land that had been the source of so much pain. Morrison had been rustling cattle from smaller ranchers for months, but he was smart about it, never taking enough from any one place to cause suspicion, always making sure he had an alibi when the thefts were discovered. But he needed a scapegoat, someone to take the blame when the law finally started asking questions. "And he chose you," Millie said, understanding beginning to dawn. "He chose me because I was courting you," Clayton confirmed. "He figured if he could get me arrested or run out of town, it would send a message to your father about what happened to people who stood in Jake Morrison's way." Tommy had been listening with the intensity of someone trying to follow a complex story. "But how did he frame you?" Clayton's jaw tightened. "He planted stolen cattle on land where I'd been working, then made sure the sheriff got an anonymous tip about where to find them. When the posse showed up, they found me with a dozen head of Morrison's cattle that I'd never seen before in my life." "Why didn't you tell them you were innocent?" Millie asked. "Why didn't you explain what really happened?" "I tried," Clayton said bitterly, "but Morrison was the most respected man in the county, and I was just a cowboy with no family and no property to speak of. It was his word against mine, and his word carried a lot more weight. When I realized the sheriff was more interested in closing the case than finding the truth, I knew I had two choices: stay and hang for crimes I didn't commit, or run. and hope I could find proof of my innocence somewhere down the line. The silence that followed was profound. Tommy stared at Clayton with new eyes, trying to reconcile the man he'd come to love with the fugitive described on the poster. Millie felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted, as if everything she thought she knew about the past had suddenly become uncertain. "So you ran," she said finally. "I ran," Clayton confirmed. "Left you a note explaining everything, but I guess it never reached you. Rode out in the middle of the night like a guilty man, even though every instinct told me to stay and fight." "The note," Millie breathed. "I never got any note." Clayton's face darkened. "Morrison again, I'd wager. He had men watching me, watching you, probably intercepted it before it could reach you." Tommy had been following the conversation with growing excitement. "But you said you hoped to find proof of your innocence. Did you? Did you ever find evidence that Jake Morrison was the real rustler?" Clayton's expression grew grim. "I did. Took me 5 years, but I found a man dying of consumption in a Denver saloon who'd worked for Morrison. Before he died, he confessed to helping with the rustling operation and gave me a written statement describing how they'd framed me." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, different from the wanted poster, newer, cleaner, written in a shaky hand, but still legible. "I've been carrying this for 25 years, he said, placing it on the table beside the wanted poster, "waiting for the right time to come back and clear my name." Millie picked up the confession with trembling fingers. As she read, her face grew pale, then flushed with anger. "This proves everything," she said. "This proves you were innocent all along." "It proves what we know to be true," Clayton corrected. "But Jake Morrison is still the most powerful man in this county, and he's had 30 years to solidify his position. Coming forward now means accusing a pillar of the community of serious crimes. It means risking everything we've built together." Tommy looked between the two adults, understanding that they stood at a crossroads that would determine not just their future, but their very identity as a family. "What do we do?" he asked. Clayton and Millie looked at each other across the table, the weight of the decision hanging between them like a bridge they would either cross together or watch burn. The rustler's confession letter lay on the kitchen table like a lit stick of dynamite, its words carrying the power to either vindicate Clayton completely or destroy everything they'd built together. Millie read it 3 times, her lips moving silently as she absorbed every detail of the dying man's testimony. "My name is Pete Garrison," the letter began in a handwriting made shaky by illness and whiskey. "I ain't got long left in this world, and I reckon it's time I made peace with my sins. For 5 years I worked for Jake Morrison, rustling cattle from small ranches across 3 counties. We was careful about it, never took enough from one place to raise suspicion, always had alibis when the law came asking questions." The confession went on to describe in damning detail how Morrison had orchestrated the frame-up, planting stolen cattle on land where Clayton worked and ensuring the sheriff would find them. It named dates, locations, and other men involved in the scheme. Most importantly, it explicitly cleared Clayton of any wrongdoing. "The boy never stole nothing," Garrison had written. "Morrison picked him because he was courting the blacksmith's daughter, and Morrison wanted that land. Figured if he could get the boy arrested or run out of town, it would send a message to the father about what happened to folks who wouldn't sell." Tommy had been pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal, his young mind wrestling with the implications of what they'd discovered. "We have to show this to Sheriff Blake," he said for the 3rd time. "We have to tell everyone the truth." "It's not that simple," Clayton said gently. "Jake Morrison isn't just some rancher anymore. He's been the mayor of Willow Creek for 15 years. He sits on the church board, the school board, the county planning commission. Half the businesses in town depend on his goodwill." Millie looked up from the confession, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. "So we're supposed to let him get away with it? We're supposed to let people go on thinking you're a criminal while he's treated like a pillar of the community?" "I'm saying we need to be careful," Clayton replied. "I've lived 30 years with this hanging over my head. I can live with it a while longer if it means protecting you and Tommy." "No," Millie said firmly, standing and smoothing her skirts with the decisive gesture of a woman who'd made up her mind. I won't have my husband living under a cloud of suspicion. I won't have Tommy growing up ashamed of his family name because we were too afraid to fight for the truth." The determination in her voice reminded Clayton why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. Millie Ray had never been one to back down from a fight when she believed she was in the right, even when the odds were stacked against her. "What are you proposing?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "We take this confession to Sheriff Blake. We demand that he investigate Morrison properly this time. We make sure the whole town knows what really happened 30 years ago." Clayton was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. "Morrison won't go down without a fight," he warned. "He's got too much to lose. He'll try to discredit the confession, discredit me, maybe even threaten you and Tommy." "Let him try," Millie said fiercely. "I'm not the same frightened girl I was 30 years ago. I've buried a husband, raised a child, and survived more heartache than Jake Morrison could imagine. If he wants a fight, he'll get one." Tommy moved to stand beside Millie, his young face set with determination. "I'm not afraid either," he said. "If Clayton's innocent, then people should know it." Looking at the two of them, his wife, and the boy who was becoming like a son to him, Clayton felt something shift in his chest. For 30 years, he'd carried his burden alone, convinced that protecting others meant keeping his secrets. But now he had a family again, people who believed in him and were willing to stand with him regardless of the cost. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll take it to Blake, but we do this together, and if things get dangerous, you both promise me you'll let me handle it." "Together," Millie agreed, then added with a slight smile, "but I'm not promising to let you handle anything by yourself. That's not how marriage works." They decided to approach Sheriff Blake the next morning, but first they needed to prepare for the confrontation they knew was coming. Clayton spent the evening going through his other papers, organizing documents that proved his legitimate business dealings over the past 30 years. If Morrison tried to claim the confession was forged, or that Clayton was still a criminal, they wanted evidence ready to counter every accusation. Millie, meanwhile, paid a visit to Doc Henderson. If they were going to accuse the most powerful man in town of serious crimes, they needed allies, people whose word carried weight in the community. "Doc," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I need to tell you something about Clayton's past, and I need you to listen with an open mind." Doc leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands folded across his stomach. "I'm listening, child." Millie told him everything about the wanted poster, the confession, Morrison's scheme to frame Clayton and pressure her father into selling his land. Doc listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "That's quite an accusation," he said when she finished. "You're essentially claiming that our mayor is a cattle rustler and a man who perverts justice for personal gain." "I'm not claiming anything," Millie replied. "I'm stating facts based on a dying man's confession. The question is whether this town cares more about the truth or about maintaining comfortable lies." Doc was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "You know this could destroy you," he said finally. "If Morrison fights back, if he convinces people that Clayton is still the criminal, and you're just a foolish woman blinded by love, your reputation will be in ruins." "My reputation survived marrying Harold when I was still in love with Clayton," Millie said quietly. "It survived being widowed and raising Tommy alone. It survived marrying Clayton after knowing him for one day. I think it can survive standing up for the truth." Meanwhile, across town, Jake Morrison was having troubles of his own. His foreman, a man named Bulls Collins, who'd worked for the Morrison Ranch for 20 years, had just delivered disturbing news. "Clayton Jessup's been asking questions at the bank," Collins reported, "talking about property investments, wanting to know about land ownership records from 30 years back. Banker seemed real helpful, too kept pulling out old files and such." Morrison's face remained impassive, but his hands tightened imperceptibly on his desk. "And? Word is he's got more money than God, and he's thinking about investing in the town. Talk is he might buy up some of the businesses that are struggling, maybe even fund improvements to the school and the church." This was worse than Morrison had feared. a wealthy Clayton Jessup, wasn't just a personal threat, was a challenge to Morrison's entire power structure. Money bought influence, and influence could buy the kind of investigation that Morrison had spent 30 years avoiding. "Keep an eye on him," Morrison said carefully. "Let me know everywhere he goes, everyone he talks to, and Collins be discreet about it." That evening, as the sun set over Willow Creek, 3 separate groups of people were making plans that would collide the next day, like storm fronts meeting on the prairie. At the Henderson cabin, Clayton, Millie, and Tommy spent their last peaceful evening as a family, reading together by lamplight, and pretending they weren't all terrified of what tomorrow might bring. "Whatever happens," Clayton said as they prepared for bed, "I want you both to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Having a family again, having people who believe in mates worth whatever price we might have to pay." Millie kissed his cheek softly. "We're going to clear your name," she said with quiet confidence, "and then we're going to build the life we should have had 30 years ago." In town, Doc Henderson sat in his study, rereading the confession letter by candlelight and weighing his options. As one of the most respected men in Willow Creek, his support could tip the balance in favor of justice. His silence could condemn an innocent man to live forever under suspicion. And in the big house on the hill that overlooked the town, Jake Morrison stood at his window, looking down at the lights scattered below him like stars fallen to earth. For 30 years, he'd been the unofficial king of this little kingdom, his word law, and his approval the difference between prosperity and ruin for most families. Tomorrow, that kingdom would be tested by the return of a ghost he'd thought buried forever. Morrison had survived range wars, market crashes, and political upheavals. He'd built his empire through cunning, ruthlessness, and an absolute refusal to let sentiment interfere with necessity. But he'd never faced an enemy who had nothing left to lose except the love of a good woman and the respect of a boy who called him family. As Morrison planned his strategy for the battle to come, he failed to realize that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are those who fight not for personal gain, but for something far more powerful, the simple desire to live honestly in the light. The confrontation began at 10 o'clock sharp on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, but would end with the truth finally dragged into the harsh light of day. Sheriff Blake's office had never felt smaller than it did with Clayton, Millie, Tommy, and Doc Henderson crowded into the space normally occupied by just the sheriff and the occasional drunk sleeping off a Saturday night. Clayton placed the confession letter on Blake's desk with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence that could change everything. "Sheriff, I believe this document proves my innocence in the cattle-rustling charges that were brought against me 30 years ago." Blake picked up the letter, his weathered face revealing nothing as he read Pete Garrison's dying confession. The office was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of horses and wagons moving along Main Street. "This is quite an accusation, Clayton," Blake said finally, looking up from the document. "You're asking me to believe that Jake Morrison, a man who's served this community faithfully for decades, orchestrated an elaborate scheme to frame you for crimes he committed himself." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Clayton replied evenly. "I'm asking you to investigate. Compare the details in that confession with the evidence from 30 years ago. Talk to people who were involved in the original case." Before Blake could respond, the office door opened and Jake Morrison himself stepped inside. He was a man in his late 50s now, his hair gone completely white but his bearing still commanding. He wore an expensive suit that marked him as a man of means, and his presence seemed to fill the small room. "Sheriff Blake," Morrison said in the smooth voice that had convinced voters to elect him mayor 5 times running. "I heard there was some kind of disturbance involving our new resident." His eyes found Clayton and hardened perceptibly. "Clayton Jessup, I must say, I'm surprised to see you back in Willow Creek." "I'll bet you are," Clayton said quietly. Morrison's gaze shifted to the confession letter on Blake's desk, and something flickered across his face too quick to identify, but not quick enough to miss entirely. "What's all this about?" Blake held up the letter. Mr. Jessup has presented what he claims is a confession from a man named Pete Garrison, stating that you framed him for cattle rustling 30 years ago. Morrison's reaction was perfect, just the right amount of shock and indignation. "That's preposterous," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Sheriff, surely you're not giving credence to the ravings of some desperado trying to clear his name with forged documents." "The document isn't forged," Doc Henderson said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. "I knew Pete Garrison before he left town. That's his handwriting, and that's his signature. I'd stake my medical license on it." Morrison's eyes narrowed as they fixed on Doc. "With respect, Doctor, handwriting can be imitated, and even if this Garrison did write this letter, who's to say he wasn't lying? Dying men sometimes confess to all sorts of things real and imagined." "Then you won't mind if Sheriff Blake investigates the claims made in the confession," Millie said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "If you're innocent, an investigation will only prove it." Morrison turned his attention to her, and his expression softened into something that might have been sympathy if it had been genuine. "Mrs. Jessup, I understand you want to believe the best of your new husband, but you have to consider the possibility that you've been deceived by a smooth-talking criminal who's preyed on your loneliness." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Tommy stepped closer to Millie, his young face flushed with anger at hearing his grandmother spoken to with such condescension. Clayton's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice level. "Careful, Morrison," he said quietly. "You're talking about my wife." "I'm talking about a good woman who's been taken advantage of," Morrison replied, "and I won't stand by and watch her reputation be destroyed by association with a known criminal." Sheriff Blake held up his hand for silence. "That's enough. Morrison, this confession makes specific claims about dates, locations, and methods. Claims that can be verified or disproven through investigation. As a law enforcement officer, I have an obligation to follow up on credible evidence of wrongdoing." Morrison's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of the cold calculation beneath his public persona. "Of course, Sheriff. I have complete confidence in your ability to separate fact from fiction." He paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, "Though I hope you'll remember who your friends are in this community when you're deciding how thoroughly to pursue these allegations." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison was reminding Blake that his re-election depended on the support of influential citizens and that antagonizing the wrong people could have serious consequences for his political future. But if Morrison expected Blake to back down, he'd misjudged his man. The sheriff had spent 30 years building a reputation for fairness and integrity, and he wasn't about to compromise it now. "My friends," Blake said slowly, "are the people who respect the law and want justice served fairly. If you're innocent, Mr. Morrison, then you have nothing to fear from an honest investigation." Morrison's smile was thin and cold. "I suppose we'll see about that, won't we?" The moment that changed everything came when Sheriff Blake reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small object wrapped in faded cloth. "Since we're discussing evidence from 30 years ago," he said slowly, "there's something else that needs to be addressed." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a silver pocket watch, its surface tarnished with age but still bearing an intricate engraving on its face. This watch was found among the personal effects of Samuel Wright the rancher, whose cattle were supposedly stolen by Clayton. Wright's widow identified it as belonging to her late husband, taken during the rustling that Clayton was accused of. Morrison's face went pale as he stared at the watch. For the first time since entering the office, his composure cracked completely. "The interesting thing," Blake continued, "is that this watch never made it into evidence during Clayton's case. I found it years later in a pawn shop in Abilene, bought it back thinking it might be important someday. But I could never figure out how it got there, since Wright's widow swore it had been stolen." Clayton looked at the watch with confused recognition. "I've seen that watch before," he said slowly, "but not on Samuel Wright." "Where?" Blake asked. Clayton's eyes moved to Morrison, whose face had gone from pale to grey. "Jake Morrison wore a watch just like that. I remember because he was always pulling it out to check the time. making a show of how important and busy he was. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his vest pocket, then stopped as he realized what he was doing. That's impossible. I've owned my watch for decades. It was my father's. Then you won't mind showing it to us, Doc Henderson said quietly. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Morrison's eyes darted between the faces surrounding him, calculating odds and measuring distances like a cornered animal looking for escape. I don't have to prove anything to you people, he said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Actually, Sheriff Blake said, standing and moving around his desk, you do. Jake Morrison, I'm placing you under arrest for the theft of this watch and on suspicion of cattle rustling and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Morrison backed toward the door, his hands raised defensively. You can't do this. I'm the mayor of this town. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, Blake said grimly, and I suggest you exercise it. But Morrison's silence was broken not by words but by action. In a desperate move that surprised everyone, he bolted for the door, shoving Tommy aside in his haste to escape. The boy stumbled but kept his footing, while Clayton and Blake both lunged after the fleeing man. Morrison made it to the street before Blake's longer legs caught up with him. The tackle sent both men sprawling in the dust of Main Street, drawing the attention of every person within 100 yards. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, watching in shock as their mayor was hauled to his feet in handcuffs. This is a travesty, Morrison shouted to the gathering crowd. I'm being railroaded by a criminal and his accomplices. Don't let them destroy the reputation of a man who served this community faithfully for 30 years. But his protests fell on increasingly deaf ears. Doc Henderson had retrieved the silver watch from the sheriff's office and was showing it to anyone who wanted to look. Several of the older residents remembered Samuel Wright and his distinctive timepiece, and their murmurs of recognition spread through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Mrs. Patterson, who had been one of Millie's harshest critics just days before, pushed through the crowd to grasp Millie's hands. "Oh, my dear," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We were so wrong about you, about your husband. Can you ever forgive us?" "There's nothing to forgive," Millie replied gently. "You believed what you thought was true. We all did." As Blake led Morrison toward the jail, the mayor made one last, desperate appeal. "You're making a mistake," he called over his shoulder. "When the truth comes out, when you realize what you've done—" "The truth is coming out," Clayton said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the morning air. "After 30 years, the truth is finally coming out." Back in the sheriff's office, Blake placed the confession letter and the pocket watch in his safe, then turned to face the small group that had changed the course of justice in Willow Creek. "It'll take time to build a complete case," he warned. "Morrison's got money and influence, and he'll hire the best lawyers he can find. But with Garrison's confession and this watch, plus whatever other evidence we can dig up, I think we can make it stick." Clayton reached into his pocket and withdrew something he'd carried for 30 years, a simple wooden ring, carved by his own hands during the long, lonely nights after he'd fled Willow Creek. It was rough and imperfect, bearing the marks of inexperienced hands and desperate love, but it represented something no amount of money could buy, a promise kept across 3 decades of separation. "Millie," he said, kneeling before his wife as he had just days ago, when he'd proposed with a wildflower. "I carved this ring for you 30 years ago, planning to give it to you on our wedding day. I've carried it ever since, hoping someday I'd have the chance to keep that promise." He slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, beside the gold band they'd exchanged at their sunrise wedding. "Now my name is cleared, and I can give this to you without shame. It's not much to look at, but it's made from the wood of the oak tree where you used to meet me, and it's carved with all the love I've carried for you through 30 years of exile." Millie looked down at the humble ring, tears blurring her vision. It was beautiful not because of its craftsmanship, but because of what it represented: love that endured, hope that survived, and faith that someday, somehow, justice would prevail. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's absolutely perfect." 3 months later, Willow Creek looked like a different town entirely. The changes weren't just physical, though Clayton's investments had certainly transformed the landscape, but something deeper had shifted in the community's spirit. It was as if the town had been holding its breath for 30 years and could finally exhale. The new schoolhouse stood where the old, crumbling building had once struggled to keep out the rain and cold. Built with Clayton's money but designed with input from every family in town, it was a source of pride that brought people together rather than dividing them. Tommy had been among the first students to attend classes in the bright, airy rooms, and his excitement about learning had become infectious among the other children. The church, too, had benefited from Clayton's generosity. The roof no longer leaked, the windows gleamed with new glass, and the bell tower that had stood silent for 5 years now chimed the hours across the valley. Reverend Matthews had privately told Clayton that Sunday attendance had doubled since the improvements were completed, as if people felt more worthy of worship in a building that reflected their hopes rather than their struggles. But perhaps the most significant change was in the people themselves. The revelation of Jake Morrison's guilt had forced the entire community to examine their assumptions about truth, justice, and the stories they told themselves about who deserved respect and who deserved suspicion. It was a painful process, but a necessary one. Morrison himself was awaiting trial in the county seat, his political career destroyed, and his ranch being managed by court-appointed overseers. Sheriff Blake had uncovered enough evidence to support charges of cattle rustling, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The man who had once seemed untouchable now faced the very real possibility of spending his remaining years in prison. The Jessup family had grown into their new life with surprising ease. Clayton had proven to be everything Millie had hoped for in a husband patient, thoughtful, and completely devoted to both her and Tommy. The boy had blossomed under Clayton's gentle guidance, learning not just practical skills like riding and roping, but more important lessons about integrity, courage, and what it meant to be a man. This particular evening found the three of them gathered around their kitchen table, which had been expanded to accommodate their growing collection of books, papers, and the general debris of a busy family life. Clayton was helping Tommy with his arithmetic, while Millie worked on a piece of embroidery sampler that would eventually hang in their bedroom, featuring their wedding date and a simple motto, "Love endures all things." "Clayton," Tommy said, looking up from his slate. "Mrs. Patterson asked me today if we were going to stay in Willow Creek forever, or if we might move somewhere else when I get older." Clayton set down his pencil and considered the question seriously. It was something he and Millie had discussed privately, whether to remain in a place that held so many painful memories or to start fresh somewhere that didn't know their history. "What did you tell her?" Clayton asked. "I told her this was home," Tommy replied without hesitation. "I told her that people who love each other don't run away from problems, they stay and fix them." Millie looked up from her needlework, her heart swelling with pride at the wisdom in those young words. "And what do you think, Clayton? Is this home?" Clayton glanced around the small cabin that had become the center of his universe. It wasn't grand or impressive or nothing like the fine houses he could afford to build with his wealth. But it was filled with love and laughter, with the everyday miracles of a family learning to be together. Through the window, he could see the garden where Millie grew her vegetables, the barn where he and Tommy worked side by side each morning, the road that had once carried him away from everything he valued, but had ultimately led him back to where he belonged. "Yes," he said simply, "this is home." Later that evening, after Tommy had gone to bed with a new book Clayton had ordered from Denver, Clayton and Millie sat together on their small front porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It had become their favorite time of day, these quiet moments when they could simply be together without the demands of work or community obligations. "I have something for you," Clayton said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He withdrew a small leather-bound book, its pages filled with his careful handwriting. "What is it?" Millie asked, accepting the book with curiosity. "Our story," Clayton replied. "I've been writing it down, everything that happened, from the day we first met to Jake Morrison's arrest. I thought Tommy should have it when he's older, so he'll understand where he came from and what his family overcame to be together." Millie opened the book to the first page, where Clayton had written, "For Tommy and for his children and for all the generations that will follow. This is the story of how love conquered time, distance, and injustice. This is the story of how two people found their way back to each other when everyone said it was impossible." But Clayton had added something else to their family story, a new family Bible, bound in soft leather and inscribed with their names and wedding date. Inside the front cover, he had written, "Given with love to the Jessup family on the occasion of new beginnings. May this book guide you through whatever storms may come, and may you always remember that some promises are worth keeping no matter how long it takes to fulfill them." "It's beautiful," Millie whispered, running her fingers over the inscription. "But you know what the most beautiful part is?" "What's that?" "The fact that our story isn't over yet. We have years ahead of us, years to build more memories, to watch Tommy grow into a man, maybe even to see grandchildren of our own someday." Clayton pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side, as if 30 years of separation had been nothing more than a long, troubled dream. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "The way we did things? Getting married so quickly, taking such a risk?" Millie was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret the years we lost," she said finally. "I regret the pain we both endured, the chances we missed. But I don't regret trusting my heart when it told me to take a leap of faith. Some risks are worth taking, Clayton, especially when the alternative is spending the rest of your life wondering, what if?" As the evening star appeared in the sky, the same star Clayton had wished on during his long journey home, he thought about the strange paths that had led them to this moment. It had taken 30 years, a false accusation, exile, heartbreak, and finally the courage to seek justice, but they had found their way back to each other. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Love had endured, truth had prevailed, and a family had been born from the ashes of old dreams deferred, but never abandoned. It was a story worth telling, a legacy worth leaving, and a promise finally kept after 3 decades of patient hope. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, silent witnesses to the endless cycle of loss and redemption, separation and reunion, justice delayed but never denied. And on a small porch in Willow Creek, 2 people who had learned that some loves are indeed worth waiting for, sat together and planned the rest of their lives, knowing that whatever challenges might come, they would face them together as they always should have, as they always would.